Welcome back to Whyloric, the podcast for curious minds. I'm your host, and every episode we explore something worth thinking about. Career, life, culture, history, or just the little whys we never stop asking. Today, we're diving into one of history's biggest questions. Why did the Roman Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations ever, actually fall? Let's get into it.
So, picture this. It's the year 476 AD, and the greatest, most insanely complex empire the Western world has ever seen just, officially collapses.
Right, the defining institution of 1,000 years is just wiped from the map.
Exactly. But here is, I think, the absolute strangest part of that entire story. If you look at the source material we're diving into today, most of the people actually living inside that empire, they didn't even notice.
No, not at all.
There was no giant explosion, no sudden dramatic apocalypse, definitely no movie credits rolling in the sky. I mean, if you were just a wheat farmer in Gaul in September of 476, the fall of Rome was basically just another Tuesday for you.
It's a completely counterintuitive reality, isn't it? I mean, we have this inherent psychological need for historical closure.
Oh, totally. We want the clean break.
Right, we want a precise date we can point to and say, right there, that's when the old world ended and the Dark Ages began. But when you study the actual source material of systemic collapse, which we are doing today, that clean line just completely evaporates.
It's messy.
It is incredibly messy. It's deeply prolonged, and honestly, it's far more fascinating than any Hollywood climax could ever be.
And that is exactly what we are decoding today. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are looking at a really vast collection of historical notes, academic analyses, and contemporary accounts examining the fall of the Roman Empire.
And our mission today is to completely dismantle that popular cinematic myth of Rome's collapse.
Right, because we aren't doing this to memorize dates or, list off a bunch of ancient kings. We're doing this because examining the mechanics of Rome's unraveling is essentially a masterclass in how massive, complex systems fail.
Exactly.
We want to help you understand the warning signs, the structural vulnerabilities, and the hidden rot that quietly weakens a superpower over centuries before the final break actually happens.
Which is, deeply relevant for anyone analyzing the world today, whether you're looking at global supply chains or international financial markets or geopolitical alliances.
You are looking at systems of immense scale.
Right. Immense scale and complexity. So understanding the anatomy of how the ancient world's ultimate complex system tore itself apart, it gives you an entirely different analytical lens for viewing our modern world.
Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is that Hollywood myth we mentioned. Because if you asked almost anyone how the Roman Empire fell, they will paint you the exact same highly vivid picture.
Oh, yeah. The barbarians at the gates.
Exactly. Hordes of barbarians storming in, marble temples burning to the ground, statues toppling over, and the emperor looking on in horror as civilization is just snuffed out in a single catastrophic wave of violence.
It's deeply cinematic, I'll give it that, but it is almost entirely wrong.
So where do we start correcting it?
Well, the paradigm shift we have to anchor on right from the beginning of these sources is the timeline. The reality of Rome's fall was not a sudden violent explosion. The analysis uses, and I think this perfectly captures the mundanity of the event, is that the collapse of Rome was far more like watching a slow leak in a tire.
A slow leak?
Yeah. It was a gradual, agonizing, awkward decline that took centuries. Plural.
Okay, I want to push back on that slow leak analogy just a bit, or at least, explore the lived experience of it. Because if we are talking about centuries of gradual decline, at what point does the average Roman citizen actually realize that the fundamental structure of their civilization is fatally compromised?
That's a great question.
Because to use a modern equivalent, we always talk about the boiling frog phenomenon, right? Where the temperature rises so slowly, the frog doesn't jump out. But historically, did a merchant in, say, 250 AD possess the macro awareness to think, oh no, the empire's in a terminal death spiral? Or did they just assume they were living through a really bad economic recession?
That gets right to the heart of what we call shifting baselines. Mm-hmm. Historians grapple with this constantly. And the short answer is no. They almost certainly did not know the empire was in terminal decline.
They just thought times were tough.
Right. And that is the terrifying part of a slow leak. Think about it. When a tire is losing a fraction of a PSI every day, you don't notice it on your daily commute.
You just get used to it.
Exactly. You gradually start adjusting. You blame the sluggish handling on the road conditions, or maybe you think the steering alignment is slightly off. You adapt to the dysfunction without realizing the structural integrity of the entire wheel is failing.
So a Roman citizen in 250 AD isn't comparing their reality to the golden age of Augustus 200 years earlier.
No, why would they?
Right, they are comparing their reality to what their parents experienced maybe 20 years prior.
Exactly. The baseline of what is considered normal just constantly shifts downward. And this ties directly into why human beings so desperately crave a singular historical villain.
We want someone to blame.
We really do. We want to point to the Goths or the Vandals or, an incompetent emperor like Nero or Commodus and say, right there, they broke the machine. But the sources highlight a deep historiographical debate. Scholars still argue passionately about when Rome actually fell.
Because it wasn't just one day.
Right. Was it 410 AD with the sack of Rome? Was it 476 AD with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus? Or did the transition into late antiquity drag on for another 2 whole centuries?
Wow.
We look for a specific date because we are incredibly uncomfortable with the idea of incremental systemic failures that take generations to manifest.
But surely, to understand why this massive system began to experience those incremental failures in the first place, we have to look at the physical architecture of the system itself. And the sources repeatedly emphasize that the foundational vulnerability of the Roman Empire was its sheer, almost incomprehensible size.
It's geographic.
The geographic trap, right. At its height, we are talking about a continuous political entity that stretched from the rain-soaked borders of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, all the way down through the Iberian Peninsula, across the entirety of North Africa, and all the way to the Euphrates River in the Middle East.
It's massive.
They effectively turned the Mediterranean Sea into an internal Roman lake. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea.
Which, don't get me wrong, is a staggering logistical achievement. But it introduces a completely unsolvable mathematical problem based on the technology of the era.
This is the causality bridge we have to cross, right? You have this continent-spanning empire, but you are operating entirely on organic power.
Yes. Muscle and wind.
Exactly. There is no telegraph, there is no fiber optic cable, no radio. The absolute speed limit of communication, administration, and military response is the speed of a horse on land, or a sailing ship dependent on the Mediterranean winds.
The sources highlight the cursus publicus, which was the state-run postal and transport system. And even with the famous Roman road network, which was a genuine engineering marvel, moving information was just painfully slow.
I can't even imagine.
Think about it. If you are the emperor sitting in Rome and a massive crisis erupts, let's say a major tribal incursion across the Rhine in Germany, how does that play out mechanically?
I visualize it as the ultimate HR nightmare. Managing a global workforce with no modern tools, the local commander has to survive the initial attack, draft a report, and hand it to a courier.
Right, assuming he survives.
Exactly. And then that courier rides for days, maybe weeks, swapping horses at way stations, crossing the Alps, moving all the way down the Italian peninsula. They finally arrive in Rome. The emperor has to convene his advisors, deliberate, formulate a strategy, draft new orders, and then send a messenger all the way back.
And that's just the communication phase.
Right. And then they have to actually mobilize the legions and march them on foot to the crisis zone.
So you are looking at a turnaround time of months. The feedback loop is inherently broken. By the time the central authority can actually respond to a localized crisis, the variables of that crisis have completely changed.
Because the enemy isn't just going to sit there and wait.
Exactly. The invaders have either moved on, they've assimilated, or they've completely destroyed the local infrastructure. You simply cannot govern a centralized state dynamically when your data is always 3 months out of date.
It's like trying to day trade on the stock market, but you only get to see the ticker prices from a month ago.
The perfect analogy.
Every decision you make is fundamentally disconnected from the current reality.
Which leads to a massive structural debate among historians that the source material touches on. Did the empire reach a point of diminishing marginal returns on its own complexity?
Meaning, at what point does it cost more to keep it than it's worth?
Exactly. At what point does the enormous administrative and military cost of maintaining this geographic footprint completely outweigh the economic and security benefits of actually possessing it?
And this wasn't a secret to the Romans, right? They recognized this administrative friction. I'm thinking of Diocletian toward the end of the 3rd century. He literally looks at the map, realizes the math doesn't work, and tries to split the management of the empire with the tetrarchy, the rule of 4, just to localize the administration.
Diocletian's tetrarchy is a perfect example of a system desperately trying to patch a structural flaw. He divided the empire into east and west and appointed a senior emperor, an Augustus, and a junior emperor, a Caesar, for both halves.
Just to have more managers on the floor, basically?
Pretty much. It was a direct acknowledgement that a single central node in Rome could no longer process the sheer volume of data and military threats required to run the empire.
Did it work?
Well, Diocletian's administrative split bought them some time, certainly. But it didn't solve the underlying disease, because whether you have one emperor or four, maintaining thousands of miles of fortified borders and a massive bureaucracy requires an astronomical amount of resources.
Which brings us perfectly to the cascading failure of the Roman economy. Because if it takes months to move orders and you have millions of square miles to defend against constant external pressure, the financial cost of that defense is going to be staggering.
Unbelievably staggering.
And the sources describe the economic unraveling of Rome not as a single catastrophic bankruptcy, but as a deeply complex, vicious cycle. It's like the worst kind of group project where no single issue destroys the whole thing, but everyone does a little bit of damage.
It is arguably one of the most thoroughly documented economic death spirals in history. The forces break down the economic rot into a triad, basically. Heavy taxation, a shrinking middle class, and hyperinflation.
But to truly understand it, we cannot just list these factors. We have to look at the exact mechanisms of how they fueled each other.
Right, the cascading effect.
Let's start with the inflation, because I think a modern listener hears the word inflation and immediately thinks of a central bank printing too much paper money. But how does an ancient empire, dealing entirely in hard currency, gold, silver, and bronze, how do they trigger a hyperinflationary crisis?
Through the mathematical sleight of hand known as currency debasement.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, for centuries, the backbone of the Roman economy was the denarius. It was a silver coin that was highly trusted and had a relatively stable silver content. But as the empire stopped expanding in the 2nd century, the influx of war booty and new slaves dried up.
So the easy money stopped flowing in.
Exactly. The empire transitioned from a growth model to a maintenance model.
And maintenance is expensive. I mean, you have to pay the legions. The Roman state essentially had a massive fixed military payroll that could not be cut without risking a mutiny.
Precisely. The state has massive fixed costs, but their revenue has plateaued. So what does a central authority do when they don't have enough physical silver to mint the coins needed to pay the soldiers?
They get creative.
They start mixing cheaper base metals, like copper or bronze, into the silver.
They stretch the recipe.
Exactly. By the 3rd century, they introduce a new coin, the Antonianus. Initially, it's supposed to be worth 2 denarii, but it actually only contains about 1.5 times the silver.
Sneaky.
Right. And over the decades, successive emperors keep debasing the coinage to meet their short-term financial obligations. By the late 3rd century, these supposedly silver coins are effectively bronze coins with a microscopic silver wash that literally rubs off after a few weeks in a pouch.
Oh, wow. But the Roman merchants aren't stupid, right? You can't just mandate that a bronze coin has the purchasing power of a silver one. The market always adjusts.
The merchants absolutely realized what was happening. If the intrinsic value of the metal in the coin drops by 90%, the merchant is going to raise the price of a loaf of bread to compensate.
Naturally.
This triggers rampant price inflation, which means the state's tax revenues, which are collected in this increasingly worthless currency, lose their purchasing power.
So the state has less real money.
Right. So the state has to mint even more debased coins to make up the difference, which drives prices even higher.
It's a classic feedback loop. But the state's response to this collapsing revenue isn't to cut back on expenses, right? It's to squeeze the population harder. And this is where the mechanism of taxation in the late empire becomes genuinely terrifying, because it systematically destroys the middle class.
We really have to talk about the curiales here.
Yes, the local elites, the town councilors. Because the Roman Empire didn't have a modern IRS. They relied on local magistrates in the provincial towns to collect the taxes.
Right. The central government in Rome, or later Milan or Ravenna, would essentially assess a province and say, your town owes us this much tax revenue this year. And it was up to the local curiales to extract it from the local population.
Sounds standard so far.
But here's the brutal catch. If the town fell short, if the farmers couldn't pay because of a drought or the merchants couldn't pay because the currency was utterly worthless, the curiales were personally, legally responsible for making up the shortfall out of their own pockets.
Which is an insane policy. You are essentially punishing your most productive, civically engaged citizens for the macroeconomic failures of the state.
It's wild.
It would be like the federal government telling a local mayor today, hey, your town's tax revenue is down 20% this year, so we are going to seize your personal bank account, sell your house, and take your assets to cover the difference.
Unsurprisingly, this policy completely hollowed out the civic middle class.
I would imagine.
Being a local magistrate used to be an immense honor. It was the bedrock of Roman civic life. But under this crushing liability, the Curions started doing everything they could to flee their positions.
Just to get away from the tax burden.
Yeah, they abandoned their estates, they tried to join the army, some even fled to the barbarian tribes just to escape the Roman tax collectors. The state eventually had to pass laws making the position of Curios hereditary and legally binding them to their towns so they couldn't escape.
So you're trapped in this terrible job forever.
Essentially, yes.
And it wasn't just the urban elites getting crushed, right? The agricultural middle class, the freeholding farmers who had historically been the backbone of the Roman legions, they were being taxed into oblivion too.
Absolutely.
And to survive, these independent farmers started willingly surrendering their land to massive, ultra-wealthy landowners in exchange for protection from the state tax collectors.
Right, the colony system.
Exactly. These free farmers became tenant farmers, tied to the land, working on massive estates owned by a handful of ultra-rich elites who had enough political power to just dodge the taxes entirely.
Which is the direct precursor to medieval feudalism and serfdom.
It really is. It is a total structural collapse of the social fabric. You have a state that is starving for revenue, so it crushes the middle class, which consolidates all the wealth into the hands of a few elites who refuse to pay taxes.
Which forces the state to debase the currency further and lean even harder on whatever middle class is left.
The economic group project has entirely derailed. Every mechanism is actively working against the survival of the state. So if the middle class is shrinking and taxes are rising, who is actually left to fund this massive HR nightmare we just talked about?
Well, that's the thing. No one. The system is structurally cannibalizing itself, creating massive friction and poverty at the local level. But this friction doesn't just manifest in empty markets, right? It ignites at the absolute highest levels of power.
Right, because when the economy is in a death spiral and the military isn't getting paid in real money, the position of emperor becomes the most dangerous job on the planet.
Which brings us to the political chaos. Specifically, the period the sources refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century.
The statistics from this period are mind-bending, just to set the table here. Between 235 AD with the assassination of Severus Alexander and 284 AD when Diocletian takes power, Rome went through at least 20, possibly over 25 emperors in roughly 50 years.
Half a century. Over 20 men claiming the purple.
Let's do the math on the lived reality of that. That is an average reign of barely 2 years, and the defining characteristic of this period is not peaceful succession. It is almost exclusively violent death.
Oh, absolutely.
They were assassinated by their own guards, killed in civil wars, or murdered by mutinous troops. It was a statistical improbability that you would survive the job. It wasn't a promotion, it was a death sentence.
It really was. And if you look at the mechanics of why this was happening, it exposes the fatal flaw in the Roman military political apparatus.
Which was?
Power had fundamentally shifted away from the Senate in Rome and out to the frontier legions. The Roman military realized that they were the actual arbiters of power.
We see this earlier too, right? With the Praetorian Guard literally auctioning off the title emperor to the highest bidder, like Didius Julianus in 193 AD.
Yes, the Praetorian Guard in the capital was a massive destabilizing force for a long time. But in the 3rd century, it became a regional issue. Picture this. A general on the Rhine frontier wins a minor victory against a Germanic tribe.
Okay.
His troops, who haven't been paid properly because of the inflation and debasement we just discussed, decide that if they declare their general as emperor, he will march on Rome, seize the treasury, and give them a massive bonus, a donativum.
Wait, so the troops are literally incentivized to commit treason because it's the only way they can get a meaningful paycheck?
Exactly. So the general is proclaimed emperor by his troops, but he knows that the moment he fails to deliver, or the moment he asks them to fight a difficult war without extra pay, they will assassinate him and pick someone else.
It's a hostage situation.
It really is. So he marches his hardened frontier troops inward toward Rome to fight the current emperor.
To use a modern corporate analogy, it is as if the regional managers of a massive multinational corporation keep taking their private security forces, marching into headquarters, and assassinating the CEO because their departmental budget was cut.
And they do this every 2 years.
That's insane.
That is precisely what it was. And if we synthesize what this level of executive turnover means for a complex system, the implications are just catastrophic. When leadership changes hands violently every 24 months, long-term planning ceases to exist.
Well, it has to. You can't execute a 20-year plan to stabilize the currency or build new fortifications along the Danube if your primary daily concern is ensuring your personal bodyguard doesn't stab you before dinner.
Exactly. The entire apparatus of the state shifts from proactive governance to reactive survival. Every policy decision is subordinated to the immediate need of keeping the current emperor alive.
Now, what happens to the borders during all this?
That's the tragic irony. While these regional armies are marching back and forth across Italy fighting each other for the throne, they are completely abandoning the very frontiers they were stationed to protect.
Which opens the door for the external pressures, the push. Because while the political elite were busy assassinating each other, they completely took their eyes off the empire's vast edges. And this is where the traditional narrative usually introduces the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns pushing in from the east.
But the sources are very careful to reframe this narrative. The movie version paints these Germanic tribes as an overwhelming, technologically superior tidal wave that smashed a healthy Roman state.
Right. But the reality of the mechanics paints a very different picture. Rome wasn't defeated because the Goths suddenly developed magical new weapons or brilliant new siege tactics. They were dealing with the exact same tribal structures Rome had been fighting and beating for centuries.
Exactly. The difference wasn't the strength of the push, it was the fragility of the structure being pushed against. The military had been stretched beyond its absolute breaking point.
Because of everything we just talked about.
Right. You have this massive geographic perimeter. You have a hollowed-out economy that cannot generate the tax revenue to pay the soldiers. You have a vanished middle class, meaning you can no longer recruit reliable citizen legionaries. And you have political chaos paralyzing the strategic command.
That detail about the recruitment is so critical. Because the Roman middle class was gone, Rome couldn't field its own armies the way it used to. So what was their solution?
Outsourcing.
They outsourced their defense. They literally hired the very barbarian tribes they were supposed to be defending against. They would tell a Gothic tribe, hey, if you settle on this side of the border and fight off the other tribes, we will pay you in gold and land.
The federati system.
Right. They were relying on mercenaries who had zero fundamental loyalty to the concept of Rome. Their loyalty was entirely transactional.
And when the Roman state inevitably ran out of money to pay those mercenaries, the mercenaries simply turned around and took what they wanted from the Romans. It is a spectacular failure of internal logic. You are arming and training your own replacements.
Which culminates perfectly in the event that everyone points to as the ultimate symbol of the fall. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric and the Visigoths.
410 AD is arguably the most psychologically devastating moment in Western history up to that point. I mean, for exactly 800 years, the city of Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy.
800 years.
Yes. So when the news spread that the Eternal City had been breached, it sent shockwaves through the entire Mediterranean world. St. Augustine wrote about it. St. Jerome said, the whole world perished in one city.
It was a massive psychological blow. But when we look at the mechanics, the sources argue that 410 AD was not the cause of the empire's collapse. It was merely a symptom of the disease we've been discussing for the last hour. Because Alaric wasn't some wild man from the woods. He was a former Roman military commander. He was a leader of the foederati who got tired of the Roman government breaking their treaties and failing to pay his men.
Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted a better contract. He wanted land for his people and a recognized position within the Roman military hierarchy. The sack of 410 was essentially an incredibly violent labor dispute.
A labor dispute. I love that framing. To quote the text directly, and I think this is the crux of the entire argument, Rome was already falling apart, and then someone gave it a push. The Visigoths didn't knock down a sturdy brick wall. They leaned against a fence that internal termites, inflation, political chaos, and bureaucratic friction had been eating away at for 200 years, and the fence finally collapsed.
If the economic triad hadn't destroyed the tax base, and the 3rd century civil wars hadn't butchered the veteran legions, The migrations of the 5th century would almost certainly have been repelled or assimilated, just as Rome had managed previous migrations.
Because they had done it before.
Countless times. The external push was only fatal because the internal structure was completely hollowed out.
So the West crumbles. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is quietly deposed in 476 AD, and the insignia of the empire is shipped off. But here is the massive plot twist that the popular narrative almost always leaves out. When we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we are really only talking about half the story.
The sequel that nobody mentions.
Yes, because the Roman Empire didn't entirely fall. The western half, Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, that collapsed into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. But the eastern half of the empire looked at the smoking ruins of the West and essentially said, "Oh, that's a shame, but we have work to do." And they kept going.
They didn't just keep going for a few decades either. The Eastern Roman Empire, which historians later dubbed the Byzantine Empire, endured for almost another 1,000 years. It finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453.
Okay, this is where I have to play devil's advocate.
Okay.
Because logically, this breaks the entire model we just built. We spent all this time detailing how the fundamental DNA of the Roman system was fatally flawed. The geographic trap, the lack of Zoom calls, the crushing taxation, the reliance on mercenaries. If the Eastern Empire was built on that exact same operating system, how on earth did it survive for a millennium after the West collapsed?
It's one of the greatest comparative case studies in history. Why does one half of a complex system die while the other half adapts and survives? The sources point us to several vital structural differences. First, let's look at the geography we discussed earlier.
Right. When Diocletian and later Constantine formally split the administration of the empire, the East inherited massive geopolitical advantages.
The center of gravity had shifted. The capital of the East was Constantinople, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait. From a defensive standpoint, Constantinople was virtually impregnable.
It's a fortress.
A massive fortress. It controlled the vital trade choke point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and it was protected by water on 3 sides and the massive Theodosian walls on the landward side. Rome, by contrast, was inland, vulnerable, and largely just a symbolic capital by the end.
The East also had the economic engine, right? They had Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the ancient world, and they controlled the incredibly lucrative trade routes coming in from the Silk Road and the East.
Exactly.
While the West, meanwhile, had these long, vulnerable borders along the Rhine and Danube, and provinces that were far less urbanized and wealthy.
And this is the critical mechanism of their survival. The East had the tax base to actually afford the massive systemic costs we discussed. Because their economy was stronger and more urbanized, they didn't suffer the total hollowing out of the middle class to the same catastrophic degree as the West.
So they could still afford to pay their armies in relatively stable coinage.
Yes. And because they could pay their own armies, they were far less reliant on the Foederati, those Germanic mercenaries who eventually turned on the West. The East centralized their military command. They didn't allow powerful barbarian generals to dictate policy the way the West did. But perhaps the most important structural lesson here comes down to the concept of downsizing.
Downsizing to save the core business.
Precisely. By allowing the West to fall, by severing themselves from the crumbling, overextended, economically drained Western provinces, the Eastern Roman Empire essentially jettisoned the dead weight that was pulling the entire civilization under.
They cut their losses.
They localized their management, shortened their supply lines, and concentrated their defensive resources on a smaller, more economically viable footprint.
They cured their geographic HR nightmare by literally cutting the map in half. They let the failing branches go bankrupt so the profitable headquarters could survive.
It is a ruthless but highly effective strategy for systemic survival, and it proves that historical collapse is rarely a binary switch. It is not an on-off state, it's a spectrum. Parts of a highly complex system can fail completely, while other nodes within that same system can adapt, restructure, and endure for centuries.
Which brings us to the ultimate question posed by the source material and the real so what of this entire deep dive. Why does any of this matter to you, the person listening right now? Why are we sitting here 1,600 years later analyzing the taxation mechanics and cavalry deployment of an ancient empire?
Because the underlying mechanics of systemic fragility are not locked in the past. They are universal principles of complexity. Anthropologists like Joseph Tainter have argued that all complex societies eventually reach a point where the cost of maintaining their own complexity yields diminishing marginal returns.
So the bigger you get, the harder it is to stay afloat.
Exactly. The warning signs we discussed today, The economic strain of a vanishing middle class, the mathematical trickery of fiat inflation, the political paralysis caused by hyperpolarization and executive turnover, and the overextension of global resources. Those are not uniquely Roman problems.
They feel uncomfortably relevant. You can read a primary source complaining about the Roman elite hoarding wealth while the currency is debased to pay for endless border conflicts, and if you change the names, it could be an op-ed in today's newspaper.
It is incredibly resonant. But the sources are also very careful to emphasize, and I want to echo this strongly, that studying the fall of Rome is not an exercise in fatalism.
Right. It is not about running around screaming that the sky is falling and modern civilization is doomed tomorrow.
No, not at all. It's about diagnosis. It's about giving ourselves the intellectual tools to recognize the early symptoms of systemic rot before the disease becomes terminal. I love how the text frames this. We often hear the cliche that history repeats itself. But that is entirely inaccurate. History doesn't repeat. As the saying goes, history rhymes.
History rhymes. I love that. The exact technological circumstances change. We have fiber optic cables instead of horses, and central banking algorithms instead of a guy clipping silver coins in a mint. But the human behaviors, the systemic pressures, the bureaucratic friction, those structural patterns echo through time.
Recognizing those rhymes makes us better, more critical observers of the massive institutions that govern our lives. It allows us to look at a global supply chain failure or an inflationary cycle, not as isolated bad luck, but as potential symptoms of a deeper structural vulnerability.
And that is exactly why we do this. To you, listening right now, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Thank you for looking past the boring history class lectures and the simplistic, cinematic myths to find the genuinely complex, fascinating reality beneath.
The reality of history is always more complex and honestly far more useful than the movie version.
We want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, a question to carry with you the next time you read the news or interact with the vast systems that sustain our modern lives.
We now know that Rome's fall was a slow leak.
Yeah.
It took centuries, and the people living through it likely didn't even realize their system was in terminal decline. They just lived their lives, complaining about rising prices, failing infrastructure, and confusing politics, always assuming the great machine would eventually correct itself. So look at the massive, complex systems you interact with every day. Global supply chains, institutions, economies. If they were experiencing their own slow leak right now, if the pressure was quietly dropping, would we even have the collective self-awareness to notice the warning signs? Or would we just assume it's another temporary flat tire on a vehicle we believe is indestructible?
And that's it for today's episode of Whyloric. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if something today made you think, made you curious, or even made you smile, let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious. This has been Whyloric. See you in the next episode.